finance was not a rigid prison of metal coins, but a living organism that could grow if only people believed in it. He was granted permission to create a private bank, the Banque Générale. Paper notes made trade easier, boosted commerce, and restored confidence. These territories were vast, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River and into the heart of the continent. The Mississippi bubble had begun to swell. The riches of Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley were more fantasy than reality. It was not until the Revolution In the early years of the 18th century, France was a nation full of grandeur, but also of fragility. The court of Louis XIV had dazzled Europe with the glory of Versailles, the splendor of endless parties, and the sight of a monarch who declared himself the Sun King. Yet behind the golden walls of his palace, the kingdom's finances were in ruins. Decades of wars, extravagant spending, and mismanagement had left France deeply in debt. The treasury was nearly empty, the state was drowning in obligations, and the people felt the weight of crushing taxes. Into this uncertain world stepped a Scottish adventurer, gambler, economist, and visionary named John Law. He was a man who believed that wealth was not limited to the gold and silver stored in vaults, but that money could be expanded through paper credit, circulation, and trust. In his eyes, finance was not a rigid prison of metal coins, but a living organism that could grow if only people believed in it. France, desperate for a savior, was willing to give him a chance. John Law's rise to power was as unlikely as it was dramatic. He had fled Britain after killing a man in a duel, wandered through Europe as a gambler, and studied financial systems with an almost obsessive passion. When he arrived in France, he captured the attention of Philippe, the Duke of Orléans, who served as regent for the young King Louis XV. The regent was intrigued by Law's radical ideas of credit and banking. At a time when France's finances were paralyzed, Law offered movement, innovation, and hope. In 1716, he was granted permission to create a private bank, the Banque Générale. For the first time in French history, the bank issued paper money backed not by gold alone, but by faith in circulation and the wealth of the kingdom itself. At first, the scheme worked brilliantly. Paper notes made trade easier, boosted commerce, and restored confidence. Merchants could carry bills instead of heavy sacks of coins, and transactions multiplied. Paris began to hum with renewed economic energy. Law's reputation grew so rapidly that he was soon entrusted with greater power. He founded the Mississippi Company, officially known as the Compagnie d'Occident, which was granted a monopoly over trade in the French territories of North America. These territories were vast, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River and into the heart of the continent. To the French imagination, this land was a paradise of untapped riches, fertile soil, precious metals, furs, timber, and trade with native peoples. It was sold as a dreamland of infinite opportunity, waiting to make investors wealthy beyond their wildest imagination. Law cleverly tied the fortunes of his Mississippi Company to the financial system he controlled. Investors could buy shares in the company using the paper notes of his bank. The more people invested, the more notes circulated, and the more confidence seemed to grow. Soon, a frenzy began. Aristocrats, Merchants and common citizens alike rushed to acquire shares. The narrow streets of Paris, particularly around the Rue Quincampoix, became a carnival of speculation. Carriages clogged the roads, crowds gathered day and night, and fortunes were made in hours. The shares skyrocketed in value. People who had lived modestly suddenly found themselves wealthy, and stories of overnight millionaires spread like wildfire. The Mississippi bubble had begun to swell. John Law became one of the most powerful men in France. His bank was transformed into the Royal Bank, controlled by the state. He became Controller General of Finances, effectively the nation's economic dictator. The regent trusted him implicitly, and the public hailed him as a genius. The dream was intoxicating. The belief that France, long crippled by debt, had discovered a magical machine that could create prosperity endlessly. The paper notes multiplied, the shares multiplied, and so did the illusions. But underneath the glittering surface, cracks were forming. The riches of Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley were more fantasy than reality. The land was fertile, yes, but it was not overflowing with gold mines or cities of silver. The company's promises of infinite wealth were exaggerated, and reports from settlers were far less glamorous than the prospectuses promised. Still, as long as people kept believing, the system seemed to hold. The price of Mississippi Company shares soared to astronomical levels. In 1719, they could be bought for around 500 livres. By early 1720, the price had surged above 10,000 livres. The frenzy was unstoppable. Paris became a city intoxicated by speculation. Servants, soldiers, artisans, and nobles all scrambled to join the rush. Pawn shops were emptied as people sold possessions to buy shares. Even bishops and nuns speculated, convinced they were part of a new era of divine prosperity. The Rue Quincampoix turned into a theater of greed, where crowds jostled, shouted, and fought for the chance to invest. Violence sometimes erupted, fortunes were won and lost in minutes. The Mississippi shares became the currency of dreams, and John Law presided over it all, like a magician controlling a spell. Yet like all spells, this one was fragile. The entire system depended on confidence, on the belief that paper notes were as good as gold, and that Mississippi land was a bottomless well of riches. But confidence is a fickle friend. By mid-1720, whispers of doubt began to spread. Some investors tried to cash out their paper for gold and silver. Law, desperate to maintain stability, restricted the exchange of paper for specie. The more he restricted, the more people panicked. The demand for physical wealth grew, and the trust in paper began to unravel. Inflation surged as more notes were printed to sustain the illusion. Prices for everyday goods soared, and ordinary citizens grew angry. What had once been a miracle now began to feel like a trap. Riots erupted in Paris as people tried to redeem their notes. Armed guards were stationed to control the mobs. The very streets that had celebrated Law now cursed his name. The price of Mississippi shares, once flying into the stratosphere, began to collapse. Investors who had mortgaged their lives to chase fortune now faced ruin. Panic spread like wildfire. The bubble burst with devastating force. By the end of 1720, the Mississippi bubble had completely collapsed. Fortunes were destroyed, families ruined, and confidence in paper money shattered. The once celebrated John Law fled France in disgrace, hounded by creditors and despised by the public. He spent the rest of his life wandering through Europe, a broken man who had once held the keys to a kingdom's economy. France was left in turmoil. The collapse of the bubble ruined trust in financial innovation for decades. The memory of this catastrophe scarred the French people so deeply that they resisted paper money and banks for generations. It was not until the Revolution, many decades later, that France attempted again to embrace such systems. The story of the Mississippi Bubble is not just about one man's ambition or one nation's dream of easy riches. It is a story about human nature. It shows how hope, greed, and imagination can build castles in the air, and how quickly those castles can collapse when doubt sets in. John Law was not entirely wrong. Credit and circulation are indeed the lifeblood of modern economies, but his vision was too far ahead of its time, and his methods too reckless. He believed he could conjure prosperity out of paper and belief, but he forgot that confidence can vanish overnight. And so the Mississippi Bubble stands as one of history's greatest financial disasters, a warning that speculation, divorced from reality, leads not to fortune, but to ruin. It is a tale of dazzling rise and crushing fall, of promises and illusions, of wealth untold and wealth undone. For France, it was a bitter lesson that no matter how bright the dream, reality cannot be ignored. For the world, it remains a timeless cautionary tale, echoing through the ages whenever markets grow too hot and promises too extravagant. This is the story of the Mississippi Bubble, a chapter in the grand saga of wealth, a tale of power, a tale of fortune, and a lesson for all of history.